The secret to handling difficult people. Have you ever walked away from a conversation with your heart racing, your stomach in knots, and your mind replaying every word, wondering how someone could be so frustrating, so cold, or just plain cruel? Let me tell you something that might change your life. Difficult people are not your problem. Your power lies not in changing them, but in transforming how you show up in the presence of their chaos. Today, I'm going to share the secret too. Handling difficult people in a way that doesn't just protect your peace, but reclaims your energy, sharpens your confidence, and sets the emotional boundaries you didn't even know you had the right to set. So, if you're tired of being drained, second-guessed, or manipulated, this is for you. Let's get into it. Most people think the difficult person in their life is the one who needs fixing. That somehow, if they could just be a little more reasonable, a little more empathetic, a little more self-aware, then peace would finally arrive. But this is a shallow view, and it's misleading, because it places all the responsibility for discomfort and tension outside yourself. And in doing so, robs you of the very agency you need to improve your life. Difficult people don't just appear to torment you. They often reflect something within you that hasn't been examined deeply enough. Something ancient and unresolved, echoing from the depths of your personality, your upbringing, your trauma, your limitations. There is a psychological phenomenon known as projection. It's a defense mechanism, an unconscious one, whereby individuals attribute their own unacceptable thoughts, feelings, and motives to another person. You might, for instance, be deeply afraid of being judged as inadequate. And so, when a colleague criticizes your work even lightly, you feel disproportionately angry or wounded. But why? Because they touched the part of you that already believes what they're saying. The critic outside mirrors the critic within. And so, the battle you think you're fighting against them is actually a war that has been raging inside you for years. The first task, then, in handling difficult people is to recognize what they activate within you. And that's not an easy undertaking. It requires introspection, vulnerability, and a willingness to face truths that you've perhaps spent a lifetime avoiding. Let's say someone constantly interrupts you in conversation. You might feel annoyed or disrespected. But beneath that, there might be a long-standing feeling that your voice doesn't matter. Maybe you grew up in a household where speaking up led to ridicule, or worse, indifference. So now as an adult, that old pain gets reignited not because of the present moment itself, but because of the meaning you assign to it. This is where personal responsibility becomes crucial. You can't change the difficult person, at least not directly. What you can do is observe how they make you feel and ask yourself, what wound is this pressing on? What belief is being challenged? What fear is being triggered? If you look closely, you'll start to see a pattern. You'll notice that it's not just this one person. You've encountered others like them before, but in function. They serve the same emotional purpose. And until you address what lies beneath that pattern, you'll keep meeting them over and over again. Because life has a strange way of handing you the same lesson until you learn it. And make no mistake, these patterns are not random. They are deeply embedded within the structure of your psyche. Jung called it the shadow, the parts of ourselves that we repress, deny, or fail to acknowledge. The shadow doesn't disappear because you ignore it. It festers. And eventually it finds expression, often through your interactions with others. That's why people can become so reactive. It's because what they're reacting to isn't just the situation. They're reacting to years of accumulated emotional residue. When someone disregards you, you don't just feel hurt. You feel abandoned, invalidated, erased. And all of that ties back to unresolved pieces of yourself that are crying out for attention. To move forward, you must stop asking, why are they like this? And start asking, why do I feel this way in response to them? That is a profound psychological shift. It's the difference between being a passive victim of your environment and an active participant in your own growth. And that growth? begins the moment you take ownership of your reactions. Not blame, not shame, but ownership. You cannot control the external chaos, but you can master your internal order. And that is no small thing. Now, let's take that insight a step further. There's a very subtle dynamic at play when you repeatedly encounter difficult people, and it has to do with the roles you unconsciously adopt. Every difficult relationship is a dance. And for the dance to continue, each party has to keep stepping. In rhythm, the moment you change your step, the dance changes. But the problem is, most people don't even realize they're dancing. They're reacting, appeasing, explaining, defending, playing a part that was likely rehearsed long before. The current actor stepped onto the stage. Take, for instance, the role of the pleaser. If you've spent most of your life trying to avoid conflict by keeping everyone happy, then when you're faced with someone who thrives on confrontation, you'll instinctively fall into your usual pattern. Apologize too quickly, over-explain yourself, bend your boundaries. And in doing so, you reinforce the dynamic. You become predictable. You play the role they expect, and they, in turn, play theirs. The manipulator needs the appeaser to function. The aggressor needs the passive recipient. The narcissist needs the empathic rescuer. It's symbiotic, even if it's toxic. So the challenge is this: stop playing the role. That doesn't mean you become aggressive or cold or unfeeling. It means you become authentic. You respond instead of react. You hold your ground, not out of pride, but out of self-respect. And this will unsettle the dynamic. People don't like it when you change the script. It threatens their control. But that discomfort is necessary because it signals that transformation is taking place. But don't expect immediate rewards. In fact, expect resistance. When you break free of your assigned role, the other person may double down on their behavior. They might escalate their manipulation, their passive aggression, their criticisms. That's because they're trying to pull you back into the old dance. And in those moments, you must remind yourself, this is a sign that you're doing something, right? Growth is not always peaceful. Often, it's loud, messy, and met with opposition. But that doesn't make it wrong. It makes it real. Now, the deeper layer of this is that changing your role means facing the fear that originally put you in that role in the first place. The fear of not being liked, the fear of rejection, the fear of being alone. These are primal, fears rooted in our earliest social experiences. And they hold tremendous psychological weight. So don't underestimate what it means to step out of your conditioned response. It's not just behavioral, it's existential. It's you saying, I no longer derive my worth from external approval. I no longer collapse to keep the peace. I no longer participate in dynamics that diminish me. And that requires clarity. It requires knowing who you are outside the influence of difficult people. That's the tragedy. In many cases, we become so entangled in managing their behavior that we lose track of our own values, our own identity, our own voice. We shrink ourselves to fit the mold they've imposed. And over time, we mistake that shrunken version of ourselves for our real self. But it's not. It's a mask, a survival mechanism. And the longer you wear it, the harder it is to breathe. So take it off, even if your hands tremble. Even if your voice shakes, even if you have to start by setting the smallest boundary or staying silent in the face of provocation. These are the steps, and they matter. Because they're not just about changing your relationship with a difficult person. They're about transforming your relationship with yourself. And perhaps that's the ultimate insight here. Difficult people serve as mirrors. Yes, but they're also invitations. Invitations to examine, to confront, to evolve. They push you to develop boundaries, resilience, clarity. They expose your blind spots. And in doing so, they offer you something invaluable, not comfort, but truth. Not ease, but strength. And that is what real growth is made of. You have to understand something crucial if you want to stop feeling powerless in the face of other people's dysfunction. Difficult individuals, those who provoke, manipulate, or dismiss, aren't necessarily trying to be cruel. Sometimes, yes, they are driven by malice or narcissism. But often, they're just acting out their own psychological scripts. That doesn't excuse the behavior, but it does contextualize it. It tells you that if you allow yourself to become reactive, to be emotionally pulled into their dysfunction, then you've surrendered the one thing you do have control over: your own behavior, your own response. When you're confronted by someone difficult, your first impulse is to push back, to correct them, to explain yourself, to match their tone. And that's understandable. You're trying to defend your identity. You're trying to preserve your place in the social hierarchy, to assert your right to be treated fairly. But here's the paradox. The more you react, the more power you give away. Because when someone can push your buttons, they're in control. They own your emotional state, and that is not a position you want to be in, not psychologically, not emotionally, not spiritually. What you need instead is discipline, not coldness, not detachment, discipline. You have to become an observer rather than a participant in their drama. That means cultivating the capacity to recognize what's actually happening instead of just responding to it. Ask yourself, why is this person saying what they're saying? What are they hoping to accomplish by acting this way? What emotional outcome are they fishing for? Because more often than not, difficult people are testing your boundaries. They're trying to pull you into a reactive state, because once they do that, they've succeeded in setting the terms of the interaction. So you must resist the temptation to justify yourself, to explain endlessly, to retaliate. All of that is noise. All of that plays directly into their strategy, whether conscious or unconscious. Instead, you stop, you breathe. You listen not to validate them, but to gather information. Because when you observe without reacting, something fascinating begins to happen. You see the pattern. You see how this person always escalates right before they're about to be held accountable. You see how they interrupt when the conversation gets too close to the truth. You notice how they belittle when they feel threatened. All of these behaviors become visible when you aren't caught up in defending yourself. And in that moment, you take back control, not over them, but over yourself. You reclaim your presence. You stop being a puppet and you start becoming a force. It's a quiet shift, but it's profound. Because you realize that their behavior doesn't have to dictate yours. You don't have to rise to their bait. You don't have to enter the emotional arena they've constructed. You can stay outside of it. And in doing so, you strip them of the very leverage they rely on. This isn't passivity. It's strength. It's strategic silence. It's restraint. And restraint is not weakness. It's the recognition that not every battle is worth fighting. And not every insult requires a response. Sometimes, the greatest act of defiance is to remain calm in the face of provocation. That's especially true when you're dealing with someone who thrives on chaos. They want to see you flustered. They want to see you lose your cool. Because when you do, you become predictable. You become controllable. You become part of the pattern they know how to navigate. But when you refuse to react, when you choose to stay grounded, they're thrown off. They're forced to confront the emptiness of their tactics. They don't know what to do with that. Because now, they have to face their own behavior without the distraction of your defensiveness. That is a powerful psychological reversal, and it doesn't happen by accident. It happens because you made the conscious decision to observe instead of argue. And that brings us to the next critical insight. You must learn to set boundaries not reactively, but proactively. Boundaries are not just rules you impose on others. They're commitments you make to yourself about what you will and will not tolerate. They are a declaration of your values. And setting them is not about punishing the other person. It's about protecting your integrity. It's about ensuring that your self-respect remains intact even when you're surrounded by people who make it their mission to undermine it. But the problem is, many people don't know how to set boundaries without guilt. They think that saying no is selfish, that choosing themselves is somehow cruel. And that's because they've been conditioned often from childhood to believe that their worth is tied to how much they give, how agreeable they are, how well they keep the peace. But that conditioning is not truth. It's a survival mechanism. And at some point, it begins to cost more than it protects. You have to understand that saying no to someone else is often saying yes to yourself. And yes, it may be uncomfortable, it may cause tension, may disrupt the status quo. But that discomfort is a sign that something new is taking shape, that you are finally putting yourself on equal footing in relationships where you've been diminished or dismissed. That's not cruelty, that's courage. It's because it takes courage to look someone in the eye and say, "This is not acceptable to me." Or even simpler, "I won't participate in this dynamic anymore." That doesn't require shouting. It doesn't require rage. It requires conviction. It requires knowing what you stand for. And the more clarity you have around your own values, the less likely you are to tolerate behavior that violates them. Clarity is power, and it's also liberating. It's because once you have it, you no longer need the approval of the difficult person. You no longer need them to validate your boundaries. You simply enforce them, calmly, consistently, without apology. That doesn't mean you become inflexible. Boundaries aren't meant to wall you off from the world. They're meant to protect the space in which you can thrive. They are not about control. They are about mutual respect. And if someone continuously disrespects your boundaries, despite your efforts to communicate them clearly, then that's not a reflection on your assertiveness. That's a reflection on them. And it may be time to reconsider the role they play. In your life, there's a brutal honesty required here, because some relationships cannot be fixed. Some people are not interested in mutual growth. They are interested in domination, submission, or emotional extraction. And if you find yourself constantly exhausted, walking on eggshells, or doubting your own sanity around someone, then that is not a sign that you need to try harder. It's a sign that you need to draw a line. Sometimes drawing that line means walking away. That's a terrifying thought for many people, because relationships, even toxic ones, can become part of our identity. We think, if I let this go, what will that say about me? But the better question is, what does it say about me if I don't? You are not responsible for fixing someone else's dysfunction. You are responsible for protecting your peace. And that begins with the decision to stop playing games that leave you diminished. The ability to set boundaries without apology is one of the most profound expressions of self-respect. It's not about being harsh. It's about being honest. It's about recognizing that your time, energy, and emotional bandwidth are not infinite. They are precious, and they should be invested in relationships that reflect mutual care. It's not emotional manipulation. You do not have to justify your limits to someone who continuously disrespects them. You do not have to soften your truth to make someone else comfortable. You are allowed to take up space. You are allowed to prioritize your well-being. And when you do that, not from a place of anger, but from a place of self-awareness, you become someone who is no longer easy to manipulate, control, or use. That is the real goal. Not to become unfeeling, not to become cynical, but to become someone who is so rooted in their own integrity that no amount of external dysfunction can shake it. Someone who listens deeply but doesn't absorb everything. Someone who responds wisely but doesn't feel compelled to fix or fight every broken dynamic. That kind of person isn't just resilient. They're formidable, because they've learned that true strength doesn't always look like force. Sometimes it looks like stillness, like silence. It's like walking away with your head held high, knowing you didn't abandon yourself in the process. When we speak about difficult people, it's easy to externalize the problem, to make it about them, about their rudeness, their manipulation, their inability to empathize. But what if we changed the lens? What if we understood that, more often than not, their dysfunction creates a crucible and opportunity to develop not only boundaries, not only discipline, but the deeper virtue of courage. And I don't mean the grandiose kind of courage that's reserved for heroic acts. I mean, the quiet, painful, deeply personal courage that it takes to remain honest when dishonesty would be easier. To remain kind when bitterness is justified. To maintain your values in environments that mock them. Because that's the reality. You will, at some point, be in a position where your values are tested not in theory, but in action. Difficult people often serve as the unwelcome catalysts. For that, they challenge your ability to remain whole in situations designed to fracture you. And the fifth principle you must understand is this: the ultimate test of your character is not how you behave when things are easy, but how you choose to stand when you are surrounded by people who make goodness feel naive and assertiveness feel like a provocation. Let's look at this psychologically. Carl Jung argued that one cannot become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And difficult people often are that darkness. They carry the traits we find most unbearable. Not only because of what they do, but because of what they force us to confront within ourselves. The impatience, the temptation toward cruelty, the desire for vengeance. These are impulses most people would rather deny. But denial doesn't eradicate. It merely pushes them into the shadow where they fester and grow stronger. So here's the question. When someone mistreats you, dismisses you, disrespects you, what part of you shows up in response? Is it the noble self you hope to embody, or the shadow that seizes the opportunity to strike back? That moment, that is where the real psychological work begins, because the person who wrongs you doesn't just offend your sense of justice. They tempt you. They seduce you into becoming something less than what you are. And if you're not aware of that process, you'll justify your dissent as necessary retaliation. You'll believe you're simply standing your ground, when in fact, you're abandoning your values in the name of pride. This is a hard truth. It suggests that your worst interactions are not simply about the other person. A mirror held up to your soul, showing you the distance between who you are and who you claim to be. And that's not meant to shame you, it's meant to awaken you. Because the purpose of confrontation is not to destroy the other. It's to see yourself more clearly in relation to the challenge. The difficult person becomes the whetstone against which your integrity is sharpened. They don't cause the virtues within you, but they reveal whether those virtues are real or just theoretical. Think of someone who speaks to you with sarcasm and contempt. It is entirely within your right to return fire, to show them they won't walk over you. But is that the highest path? Or is it an ego game dressed in the language of strength? True strength might look like silence in that moment, because you're weak, but because you refuse to play a game that costs you your peace. Or maybe it means saying, clearly and without venom, I don't accept being spoken to like that. If you want to have a real conversation, I'm here. That's not weakness. It's terrifying power. Because it says, I am not afraid of you, and I do not need to dominate you to hold my ground. That kind of response comes from deep inner clarity. It comes from someone who's wrestled with their own darker instincts and chosen, consciously, not to be governed by them. And to reach that point, you have to stop seeing the difficult person as your adversary. They're more like a gatekeeper. They block your path not only externally, but symbolically. They stand in front of you and demand, will you rise or will you sink? Will you embody your higher self or descend into the pit you claim to despise? And each time you answer with principle instead of impulse, you become a little more formidable, a little more aligned, a little more whole. That leads us to the sixth insight. Do not try to change the difficult person. That's not your job, and it's not your responsibility. You can express, you can set limits, you can offer feedback. But you cannot rewrite someone's personality, undo their trauma, or reprogram their worldview. People don't change because you want them to. They change, if ever, because they choose to be, because the cost of staying the same becomes greater than the pain of transformation. And trying to change them before they reach that point is like throwing yourself against a locked door, hoping Your bruises will inspire it to open. What does that mean practically? It means you stop centering your energy on their dysfunction. You stop analyzing every word they say, trying to decode what they really meant. You stop drafting endless mental scripts for how to convince them to treat you better. That obsession is a form of self-abandonment. It seduces you into the illusion that if you could just do the right thing, say the right thing, be the right thing, then they would finally be reasonable. But that fantasy keeps you tethered to a dynamic that drains you. And worse, it implies that their bad behavior is your fault to fix. There's a deeper psychological danger there. Because when you internalize the responsibility for another person's dysfunction, you turn their problem into your identity. You become the fixer, the peacekeeper, the martyr. And those roles might earn you temporary approval, but they erode your soul over time. You begin to tolerate disrespect in the name of compassion. You begin to sacrifice your own mental health in the name of understanding. And slowly, imperceptibly, you lose sight of where they end and you begin. You must reclaim that boundary. And part of reclaiming it means releasing the fantasy that your love, your patience, or your insight will somehow redeem them. It might, but more often, it won't. Because change requires readiness. And readiness cannot be forced, must be chosen. And your task, if you want to remain psychologically intact, is not to wait around for someone else to become who you need them to be. Your task is to become who you are meant to be, regardless of whether they ever catch up. This is where many people falter. They believe that choosing themselves is cruel. That detaching from the toxic dynamic is abandonment. That walking away is an act of selfishness, but it isn't. It's maturity. It's self-preservation. And it's the realization that your life is not a rehabilitation center for the emotionally unavailable. You were not put on this earth to fix everyone who wounds you. You were put here to live in truth. And sometimes truth demands distance. Now, that distance doesn't have to be permanent. It doesn't have to be angry. But it does have to be clear. It has to be rooted in the recognition that if someone shows you through their words, their actions, their patterns that they are unwilling or unable to meet you in a place of mutual respect, then you must act accordingly. Not because you hate them, but because you love yourself enough to stop bleeding for someone who doesn't even acknowledge the wound. And ironically, sometimes your withdrawal becomes the catalyst for their awakening. Not always, but sometimes. 'Cause when you stop enabling, when you stop over-explaining, when you stop showing up to a dynamic that only depletes you, you force them to confront the emptiness of their own behavior. You disrupt the supply of attention or control they were feeding on. And in that void, they might begin to ask questions. They might begin to see what you were trying to say all along. But if they don't, that's okay too. Because you're healing. Your growth, your freedom, cannot be contingent on their realization. It must be anchored in your own choice. And that choice is the most psychologically liberating decision you can make. It says, I do not need your validation to honor my truth. I do not need your agreement to enforce my boundary. I do not need your transformation to commit to my own. That is not coldness. That is clarity. That is the transformation from being someone who is constantly wounded by difficult people to someone who is no longer defined by them. Someone who sees through the drama, who names what is real, who lives in alignment. And that is how you begin. To transcend the chaos not by defeating the difficult person, but by refusing to become them. Not by hoping they'll change, but by becoming someone who no longer needs them to. Because your peace, your identity, your worth, noon of it, is held in their hands. And the sooner you reclaim that, the freer you become. When we finally begin to understand the weight of our interactions with difficult people as obstacles to our happiness. But as the fire that forges who we are, it becomes evident that we're not just trying to learn how to deal with them, we're trying to learn how to remain whole in a world that is often fragmented. That brings us to something few people want to consider. Your history with difficult people is probably not random. It's patterned. It's familiar. And there's a reason for that. If you take a hard, unflinching look at your life, you'll see that many of the difficult people you've encountered share certain traits. They dismiss your boundaries. They make you feel like your emotions are too much. They chip away at your confidence, not with overt cruelty necessarily, but with subtle, undermining gestures. Why is that familiar? Why does it feel like home? Because often, what we interpret as merely difficult is actually an echo. It's a reenactment of a psychological wound you've carried since childhood. You gravitate unconsciously toward dynamics that feel known. If you had a parent who was emotionally distant, you may find yourself in relationships where you constantly feel the need to prove your worth. If love was conditional when you were growing up, you may now bend over backwards to earn approval, interpreting every criticism as a verdict on your identity. And this, right here, is the trap, because you think you're dealing with a difficult person in the present, when in reality, you're reliving an unresolved script from your past. This is not your fault. It is, however, your responsibility to become aware of it. Because as long as you're unconscious of the script, you will keep playing your role. The pleaser, the peacemaker, the one who absorbs the blame to keep the peace, and that might earn you temporary acceptance. But it won't give you peace. It won't give you authenticity. It will keep you stuck in a loop where your self-worth is contingent on someone else's emotional weather. And that is a terrible position to be in. To break that pattern, you have to stop looking at the difficult person as the problem. You have to look inward and ask, why does this feel so familiar? What belief about myself is being activated here? Because it's not just the person's words that hurt. It's what those words confirm about the fears you already carry. The fear that you're not enough, that you're too much, that you'll be abandoned if you assert yourself. That being loved means being small, being silent, being easy to manage. These are not abstract fears. These are the core emotional frameworks that govern how you show up in relationships. And if you want to reclaim your strength, not just in relation to difficult people, but in every part of your life, you must examine those frameworks. You must rewrite them. Because until you do, every confrontation will feel like a battle for survival. Every boundary will feel like a betrayal. Every disagreement will feel like rejection. And that's not about the difficult person. That's about the lens through which you're seeing yourself. Let me be clear. This is painful work. It requires a kind of honesty that most people aren't willing to face. Because it's far easier to say they are toxic than to ask, why do I keep choosing people who can't see me? It's far easier to complain about manipulation than to ask, why do I tolerate being emotionally starved? But if you have the courage to face those questions, you begin to step into a place of psychological sovereignty. You stop reacting and start discerning. You begin to recognize red flags, not as puzzles to solve, but as warnings to honor. And when you reach that point, you begin to realize that healing is not just about removing difficult people from your life. It's about removing the hooks that keep you attached to them. The need for their approval. The fantasy that they'll suddenly become kind. The belief that if you were just better, they would love you differently. Those are the real chains. And they are chains of the mind. You can walk away from the person, but if you don't change the beliefs, you'll find another version of them soon enough. This is what psychological individuation is about. Becoming a whole person. A person who no longer sees herself through the eyes of those who couldn't love her properly. A person who no longer adapts her truth to avoid conflict. A person who is no longer addicted to being needed, liked, or chosen. Because when you're free from that addiction, you can finally choose yourself not from a place of spite, but from a place of clarity. You can say no not because you're hard-hearted, but because your soul recognizes what does not serve it anymore. This leads directly into the final insight, which is perhaps the most existential of them all. The difficult person in your life. is not just a challenge, they are an invitation. It's an invitation to wake up, to stop waiting for external peace and start cultivating inner strength. They are the storm that reveals the cracks in your foundation. And your task is not to curse the storm, it is to strengthen the foundation. Strengthening your foundation means this. You become someone who no longer needs validation to feel secure. You become someone who can tolerate discomfort without crumbling. You become someone who tells the truth not to wound, but to liberate. And that truth-telling begins with yourself. No more pretending you're okay when you're not. No more smiling through the pain to keep things pleasant. No more betraying your instincts because you're afraid of seeming selfish. You begin to live aligned. And alignment, unlike comfort, is not cheap. It costs you something. It costs you relationships that were built on your silence. It costs you the illusion of being the good one. What you gain in return is your soul. And that is the greatest paradox of all. Difficult people are not just here to test you. They're here to refine you. They drag to the surface every wound, every unresolved fear, every shadow part of yourself you've tried to ignore. They offer you a choice: collapse or confront. Retreat into resentment or rise into responsibility. You won't always make the right choice. You'll falter. You'll fall back into old patterns. But with every conscious step, you build something unshakable inside you. A core, a truth, a presence. Eventually, you'll look back on the people who triggered the deepest pain and see something strange. They were also your teachers, not because they were wise, but because they exposed what still needed healing, because they forced you to choose. It's because they shattered the illusion that staying small was safe. And when you've integrated that lesson, not just intellectually, but viscerally, stop asking, how do I get them to treat me better? And start asking, how do I become someone who no longer tolerates mistreatment as love? That shift is the beginning of freedom. Not just freedom from difficult people, but freedom from the patterns that attracted them. Freedom from the internalized belief that suffering is the price of connection. Freedom from the need to earn your place. That is the most powerful position you can inhabit, not because it shields you from pain, but because it teaches you to stand inside the pain without losing yourself. And in the end, that's what this whole journey is about. Reclaiming the parts of yourself you abandoned to make others comfortable. Refusing to sacrifice your integrity for belonging. Becoming someone who chooses self-respect, even when it costs connection. That's not just emotional maturity. That's moral maturity. And once you taste that, once you live from that place, you'll realize that no difficult person is stronger than a person who is no longer afraid to live in truth. Here's what I want you to remember. Difficult people will always exist, but they don't have to steal your peace, sabotage your worth, or take up residence in your mind. You have the power to rewrite the script, not by controlling them, but by commanding yourself. If this spoke to something deep inside you, if you felt the exhaustion, the frustration, the emotional toll, then let's talk about it in the comments. I want to hear from you. What resonated the most? What have you learned from handling difficult people? If this helped you, like it. If you know someone who needs this today, share it. And if you want more raw, real, and healing conversations like this, subscribe and hit that bell so you never miss a moment of growth. And before you go, drop a comment below and tell me, what topic do you want us to unpack next? Your voice matters. Here, your healing matters here. And I can't wait to go deeper with you in the next video.